What happened to tanks and stances? Where did cleric stance go? What happened to options? But when we really think about it, was it really options we lost? Or was it more like simply ways to choose wrong? Whether it was a tank, quote-unquote, choosing the wrong stance, a healer being afraid to use cleric stance and then not attacking, or a DPS spending time on unneeded crowd control, whether these things were perceived as options or the ability to choose wrong depended on what kind of player you asked, and what the right answer was also depended on what kind of content you were situated in, and again, what players you were playing with. However, in Dawntrail, there isn't that much choice, but as long as we have options, we have the capacity to choose wrong. That all sounds a bit confusing, I suppose, so let's try to dive a bit deeper. Over the years, jobs in Final Fantasy XIV have become more and more streamlined, with actions serving little or no purpose either getting removed or being repurposed to make sense in the toolkit. Well, mostly. Outside of supremely situational role actions like leg and foot graze, as well as sleep and repose, most jobs don't really have truly situational options, and even among these role actions, only sleep and repose truly come at a cost, as they require a GCD to even use in the first place. Among the non-limited combat jobs, it could be argued the only truly situational weapon skills and spells boil down to Paladin's Shield Bash, a weapon skill based stun, Ninja's Hyoton, a ninjutsu spending bind, and Black Mage's Scathe, at higher levels, a supremely situational mobility option, as well as, arguably, Blizzard 1 once better options are learned. If we take a step further, Paladin's Clemency and Red Mage's Vacure, as well as, roughly speaking, every GCD-based healing option healers have aside from Lily's, could also be argued to be situational, although at the very least the situations these actions are helpful in come up frequently enough. Aside from these rather specific situational options, most if not all combat jobs essentially have the choice between various ways of doing more damage, or alternatively, when they want to use a defensive option. Obviously, a defensive option always has the capacity to be used incorrectly, but in a weird twist, not using it at all is often considered even worse, meaning that the wrong choice is ultimately to not use it. A Pictomancer choosing to paint their living motif now, or 5 GCDs from now, is indeed a choice, but it isn't exactly that much different from a warrior choosing between extending Surging Tempest at 29 seconds left or 7 seconds left. Or a Vibra choosing to use Vicewinder right when they get a charge, or when there's about 5 seconds until they generate the second charge. In fact, all 3 options simply leave the door open to do worse than that. Meaning that by the way we perceive playing these jobs, well, these tools are not situational at all, and are not really choices, as they're more opportunities to, well, choose wrong. Although, the more unstructured and flexible a job is, the less likely it is that someone is going to notice. For instance, it is very easy to notice a healer doing things wrong, quote-unquote, as a lot of players recognize that at a certain level, healers don't really need to cast that many healing spells. Certainly not in casual content, meaning that it can be perceived as a mistake to cast a healing spell in many scenarios. Another example is the general knowledge that once Warrior unlocks Raw Intuition and Bloodwetting, on an AoE pull, the Warrior essentially has hallowed ground for 6 to 8 seconds on a measly 25-second cooldown. So, when a Warrior does not use such an option enough, it is perceived as a mistake. chiefly among DPS, Black Mage, because of its cast time centric rotation, is also very easy to analyze mistakes on. As the job highlights exactly what it is doing at any time, any player that knows the basics of Black Mage can see if you're using the wrong spell sequence. It is very obvious if you're choosing to not use fire spells. It is very obvious if you're not using enough fire spells, or the wrong fire spell. Everyone can see it, and by design, it isn't really like there is a good reason to do things differently beyond simply not knowing. Meaning that Black Mage has incredible flexibility in its choice of what it wants to do, which then falls flat on its face because there are only a handful of correct, quote-unquote, choices to make as you go through the rotation, despite how creative Black Mage can be. A kind of result of this incredible streamlining of jobs in Final Fantasy XIV is that some jobs, in fact many jobs, feel kind of like they're structured specifically to work in a single target boss fight with no downtime. And so the jobs get really weird and wacky in almost any other situation. It produces this strange effect where a mage capable of accessing thunder, fire and ice, being completely incapable of doing anything more creative with all three at their disposal than raw destruction, because slowing something, or snaring something, is completely irrelevant in a real boss fight. Another mage, touted as the jack of all trades, boils down to a toolkit consisting of, again, raw destruction, a simple healing spell, and a resurrection spell. Not even the mage capable of summoning Titan is capable of harnessing anything even remotely comparable to Titan's signature jail spell. The same idea could be applied to the various other DPS jobs. At best, the various melee DPS have roughly one defensive cooldown, with Samurai and Ninja both standing out for having something slightly more interesting in Samurai's Tengetsu and Ninja's Hyoton, however situational it is. In fact, Hyoton is in most cases probably only used to become Hyoshiranryu, which again is not surprising. To be perfectly clear, there is probably a good reason why the game has developed in this way, and a way to understand that might be to go through the history books and see what options we used to have. Let's start with the mages. Originally, Black Mage's Blizzard 1 actually applied heavy, movement slow, on every cast, and Arcanist, meaning both of its jobs, had Miasma, which not only did the same, but also applied a healing reduction effect to the target. Although, in fairness, how often would that be helpful? Both of these effects were removed with Stormblood. Would it be helpful to be able to apply heavy to an enemy on command like this? In most group content, probably not. However, in solo content, whether open world or something like a run in Palace of the Dead, it could be kind of handy to be able to slow down the movement of enemies, so a fragile job like Black Mage got a bit more breathing room before the enemy reaches them. Black Mage's Freeze and Summoner's Tri-Bind also both were area of effect binds, although they did horrendously poor damage. Summoner and Scholar's Ruin 2, which they used to share, also applied a blind effect for a while. What the heavy and blinding effects on spammable and, more importantly, likely common rotational attacks have in common is that due to the existence of diminishing returns, it could be incredibly annoying to deal with the prospect that, oh, now that you actually need a heavy effect, the enemy is now immune, a bit similar to the holy stuns we still deal with now. Is that really important though? Probably not. I do wonder why Blizzard 1 specifically lost this property though. More examples of this include how some jobs used to have stuns and interrupts in their actual toolkits. In Stormblood, Ninja uniquely had Joculate, an ability that did some damage and silenced the enemy for a brief moment. This effectively resulted in the same effect as interrupts do today. Dragoon's Spine Shatter Dive, F in the chat for that, also stunned their target briefly in addition to doing damage. And Monk, instead of 4-point Fury, had One Ilm Punch, a single target weapon skill that stunned the target for a single second, but ignored diminishing returns. At one point, this action instead removed a buff from the target. Incidentally, Blue Mage has spells that do both of these things now. Moving on to healers. Back in the day, you could say, as healers in general had a bit less OGCD resources to work with, there was, in a way, a lot more to think about when choosing what you did with your GCD. Before Shadowbringers, both White Mage and Scholar typically had 2 dots on different timers to maintain as well. Now, I don't want to get too deep into a discussion about healers healing with GCDs, because depending on who you ask, ranging from A Realm Reborn to Stormblood, you could easily find players arguing that not even in A Realm Reborn did healers need to cast any healing spells really, while simultaneously having players arguing the opposite, that in fact it was only the absolute cream of the crop that could get away with attacking at all. And I'm sure both can be true simultaneously depending on who you played with. However, the important aspect is that with the sheer magnitude of options healers have today, the frequency in which a healer has to use healing spells has greatly reduced over the years. Nowadays, it's mostly for low-level content, for when things go really wrong or in particularly brutal mechanics. And finally, tanks, whose toolkits, by design, often leave the most flexibility available. Before Shadowbringers, Paladin had an ability called Shield Swipe, which did some damage and could even pacify enemies, but could only be used after blocking an attack. This essentially meant that if you had a Paladin tank, they really wanted to be main tanking, as they effectively lost DPS by not doing so. Similarly, before Stormblood, Dark Knight had a greater emphasis on parrying, and Reprisal was a counter-attack weapon skill that could only be accessed after parrying, essentially meaning that the Dark Knight lost some value if they were not main tanking. I imagine you can possibly see the problem here. Further adding to this, before Shadowbringers, tanks had a tanking stance, reducing damage done, taken, and increased enmity generated. In the case of Warrior, instead of reducing damage taken, they increased their max HP and healing received. They also had a damage stance, which roughly increased damage done in some way or another. On top of this, Dark Knight in particular could use their Dark Arts ability to empower their next action, some of which would add some sort of defensive property for doing so. For example, Abyssal Drain was the more damage AoE MP spender for Dark Knight, but would additionally heal the Dark Knight only if Dark Arts was in effect. Dark Passenger was a line AoE that did more damage and blinded enemies when empowered by Dark Arts. Dark Mind reduced magic damage taken by twice as much if empowered by Dark Arts. For another example, Warriors in a Beast, only available in their tank stance, replacing Fellcleave, did significantly less damage, but reduced damage taken for a little bit and healed the warrior a ton as well. Now, of all these things I've listed, each of them have been either altered, in the case of Blizzard 1, removed or simplified. For instance, Inner Beast simply upgrades into Fellcleave now, as there is no damage stance to swap to. But why is that? For many of them, the best explanation I personally could possibly give is streamlining. If the job didn't need the option for the main content, might as well get rid of it, right? Concentrates the job's main ideas more. For others, it could be argued that it led to weird gameplay choices. Ninja's Joculate doing damage while also being an interrupt meant that in most situations where Joculate could be helpful, it would probably be on cooldown in the pursuit of maximum damage. Delegate the interrupting to a job whose interrupt does not come at a damage loss. Why should healers need to switch to attack mode with Cleric stance? Isn't that just weird? In fact, as the game moved more and more to support healers attacking, forcing Sprout healers to commit to it would make it much scarier, and so by extension, a much harder sell to get them to start attacking in the first place. Arguably, this idea of committing to attacking definitely adds some complexity some players would enjoy. And finally, tanks of course lost the distinction between tanking and damaging stances when enmity was simplified. However, as it turns out, in a solid group, enmity management was something the rest of the group did. The tanks just established it, meaning the actual tank stances tended to only come up in groups where the rest of the team simply wasn't skilled enough to stay below the tank. Which in a roundabout way meant that you could argue that the warrior got punished for their healers and DPS not being able to manage their enmity, and as a result, the warrior wasn't allowed access to Fellcleave. Most definitely, if that was the problem, just that, then surely there would be a job design where warriors didn't get punished while still being able to play with stances. But I suppose the problem isn't just that. Doing 20% less damage because of enmity management issues still probably would suck. In the context of specifically a dungeon group with a tank, 2 DPS and a healer, or a raid, or a trial or similar with 2 tanks, 2 healers and 4 DPS and whatnot, the toolkits we have today are relatively well designed. The kind of duties we're offered don't require or really benefit from a mage having on-demand heavy debuffs or an AoE bind. The fact none of the tanks garner a damage benefit from main tanking leads to more flexibility in group compositions. No need to fight over who's main tanking for that. Overall, the jobs work well in their respective roles in a group composition with these roles filled in. Sometimes, a job might overstep their bounds in what they can do, stepping over the toes of the other roles. I'm looking at you, warrior. But overall, it all makes somewhat sense. But when you get into content with less structure in it, whether it is the attempt to solo a duty meant for a party or doing something more obtuse like a deep dungeon or a field operation, is when it really becomes clear that most jobs really just have 30 different ways of hitting very hard. But when the majority of content in the game only really requires that specific property, it would mean that having other options than that would just be pack filler in the toolkit, taking up precious button space for nothing, or simply serve as opportunities for players to choose wrong. But is that so bad? The observations I make through this trip through time and comparing to what we have now is that streamlining all the jobs means that there are less, I suppose, obvious mistakes you can make. But it also has this effect where, because there is what feels like only the right choice and the wrong choice as a result of this streamlining process, a tendency for a lot of players to assume everyone knows how to play the job. It's so obvious, just press the glowy button. Yes, there's 3 or 4 choices, but it should be obvious what the right one is, surely. So by removing all of these situational options and removing the need to choose extra well, like switching to the damage stance as a tank, it becomes less likely you would choose wrong. Possibly, but it has, at least to my observation, become more frequent as a result that players are expected to know how to play these streamlined jobs, even if it still might not be totally obvious what the right choice is. So by removing some of the wrong options, the minimum expectation has raised significantly, even if the obviousness, I suppose, of the right choice hasn't improved that much. We just cut down some of the trees, and definitely some jobs have so little choices left that it can be hard to choose wrong, but most definitely, absolutely, some jobs still leave enough choice open that you could definitely choose wrong. But is that a good or a bad thing? My best guess as to why things get so streamlined is that by removing ways to choose wrong, quote unquote, players have less disagreements and confrontations. Many other things in the game seem to have been simplified and streamlined with a similar effect, but as far as I can see at least, players will find ways to disagree anyway, so removing these options lead to things like a wizard that only knows Fireball and reduces the amount of opportunities a player has to feel like they figured it out. They are probably going to get told how to do it right anyway, but what do you think? Do you miss back when jobs had all these weird and wacky tools, or do you think it might be for the best that jobs just have their main rotation tools focused and ready, regardless of what that might mean outside of content made for that? I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, while Black Mage's Scathe is, broadly speaking, considered nearly completely useless or outright pointless in most situations, in Palace of the Dead solo, it is apparently an okay option, as Black Mage has so few mobility options, and just standing there and taking it is rarely a good choice when you get to the higher floors. Or lower floors, I suppose.